can say there's not a clear understanding of what my view of what a critic does and what really the purpose of my work, particularly when I'm working with younger architects that are in the process of formation. The least thing I'm interested in is judging them. I don't really see any point in it. I don't really see any point in it in virtually any practice whatsoever. There's too many good artists. It used to be the tradition in art and in art criticism or of a certain ilk, particularly journalistic criticism, that the job of the critic was to say, you know, good or bad, thumbs up, thumbs down. I suppose that matters in movies, you know, like go see it, don't go see it, go spend 50 cents, don't go spend 50 cents, and now it's don't go spend. Suppose these days it's like don't spend $100. Could matter. Doesn't matter to me. I sneak in the back door. But, and it's also, I don't have to review every architect that comes up or all that sort of stuff. So I get to pick who I pay attention to. And if I'm going to pick to pay attention to somebody, why would I pick to pay attention to somebody I'm not interested in or whose work I really don't like? There's lots of architects I don't like. But there's a whole lot of architects that I'm totally indifferent to. I mean, like a whole lot. So let's say I don't like right now, or I haven't liked for a while, Bjarke Ingels. But he's been on my nerves for a long time. But I walk around a lot of cities and I see a whole lot of buildings that just leave me totally blank. So at least Bjarke Ingels is in my life. So I'm more interested in that than the 5,000 professional architects, service architects that I'm totally indifferent to. So I pay attention to Bjarke Ingels' work, or I pay attention to work that gets on my nerves but stays in my consciousness. Sometimes I, in the end, change my mind and turn my attention to it. And I've told you this story many times. That's how I finally came around to Wolf and Eric. And now, at this moment in my life, they rank as my first and second interest because I've gone so deeply into their work and I've embraced it so thoroughly, and they're new to me. So I don't think they're better than Tom or Peter Eisman or Frank Gehry or any of the other architects I've spent a lot of time on. Certainly not, you know, Jesse and my colleagues, Jesse Reiser and Greg Lynn and those, you know, Ben Van Berkel and that group of people. There's probably 24 architects I've spent a lot of time with and am in a constructive dialogue with. But so I count Eric and Wolf as, you know, my latest discoveries, and there's young architects that I'm beginning to get to know, and many of them are those that we're talking about tonight. But also Liam Young, who you'll meet, and now Dwayne and Jenny, and so stuff. What happens for me is I look at the work, I'm drawn to the work. As is always the case, particularly when you're someone my age, I cannot but understand it as a version of something I know. It would be impossible for me to do otherwise, and it's going to become impossible for you to do otherwise as you get older and older and older. So I look at the work, and for example, in this case, I've seen a lot of work that uses similar lines in space, similar tectonics. I know the work of Lev Woods. I know some early work of Scafidio and Diller. I mean, I know a lot of drawing in space, and I also know a lot of tectonic work that uses cabling, and it's not that hard for me to see analogies to it. But I also see lots of differences to it. I have no trouble finding its own place, but that means I have to do a lot of extra work to get out of my own habits. So my job, first of all, is to do that. That takes longer. It's harder and harder to do. But second of all, then I have to find where that takes me somewhere new, you know. And so And oftentimes that becomes a cultural problem. And in fact, just so those of you that don't know me and don't hear me speak a lot, probably the first thing I did of any merit in the field of architecture and generally in the field of cultural conversation was to address the problem of collage, was to challenge the status of the problem of collage in the arts and in arts discourse and in architecture particularly. Was to declare the end of collage as a viable model for thinking in all art forms, basically across the board, whether it was in literature, visual studies, poetry, visual arts, or architecture. And not because I thought it was bad, but because I think it had ended its ability to be an effective tool. And it had been the longest lived and most powerful, effective tool of challenging the status quo in art history. And so to do that, it was a kind of easy gimmick, I remember Johnny Rotten said, I don't know much about music, but I know it doesn't have anything to do with chords. And it wasn't like he overturned all of music history with that one statement. So I could come outside and say, oh, don't do collage anymore. And, you had to kind of put a case of it. And the point I was saying is no one could see a collage anymore. All you could see was that it was a collage. You couldn't tell the difference between one collage or another collage. All you could do is recognize its institutional status as a collage, and you were inured to the effect of a collage. And at that point, so I made several arguments about why that was the case and why we had to look at other models of continuity. And you'll see, for example, all of this stuff, it was at a period of time when software and issues of morphing and issues in philosophical discourse were leading us into flows and connectivities. And in fact, today we'll see a bench in a project, the Dwell, what's it called, the Dwell? Yeah, anyway, you'll see stuff connected together for no apparent reason. A bench is connected to a display screen. Not that it's good or bad, but it's connected there out of a kind of, not a habit either, but not for reasons. Let's put it that way. Would that be fair to say? It's not part of a discourse. You see it all the time. You see it everywhere. So much so that I've actually recently begun to think, okay, I'm for collage again, but a new kind of collage. So this is what happens. So you have to kind of work at what's become a cliche. Cliches are not bad. Cliches are, in fact, good. Cliches that no longer work are when you start to do your work. And so that's part of it. So I borrowed Marcella's template for all future slide designs. So this is the title, but I want to start with this image. We're going to end on this image too. And actually, I'm going to ask you the question. And so my argument is this: my job is to look at what they're doing, and then all of a sudden, if they do something that I don't understand, it's not to say, well, you were doing really good things. This is not on the right track. Why did you get off track? You should get back on track. My job is to say, wow, they're going on a different track. That track must be the right track. What's wrong with me? And this is what I was trying to tell Marcelo and Tom, that they misunderstand. They thought I was saying I didn't like a certain project, or they were on the wrong track and they need to get back on the right track. That is absolutely not right. I don't waste my time doing that. I notice something and I trust that their intuitions, whatever their directions are, no, it's not always right. There are lots of dead ends. But I want you to, and what we're going to explore first in this conversation tonight is the one thing I try to do that other critics and other commentators don't do. The fantastic piece of luck for you guys is this book on Dwayne and Jenny that's come out. I hope you see it. It's oddly called Three Pavilions, but it's really an excellent review of their work, the work that we're going to cover today, with some commentary. One commentary by I don't know, I actually know, Dora Epstein, I guess she is now. One by Hernan and one by, I keep thinking of him as Tom Hayden ever since I saw the last graduation, he and Hernan looked like the Godfather, but his name is John Enright. And it's a fantastic set of three short commentaries. Dora is interested in the history, when does tectonics as a historical idea arise, because she sees their work as coming out of the notion of tectonics and struggling with the relationship between ornament and tectonics, and Hernan is looking at the work as drawing on the aesthetic power of incomplete works, or everyone likes an incomplete work or an unbuilt architecture, and we all know that effect. And John Enright is looking at the impulse towards the prototypical that we all are thinking about today. We've just gone through a 30-year period or a 40-year period where every architect wanted to do a one-of-a-kind, wanted to avoid the problem of the prototypical, because the prototypical seemed politically discredited. To make prototypes of architecture meant to categorize people's lives in a coarse and ham-fisted way. And so every architect wanted to do something idiosyncratic and something slightly different. And now there's an urge to think the prototype, but perhaps the prototype in a different way, a prototype of relationships that are not just one kind of building for every kind of solution. And John is looking at that and sees that in the repetitive studies and the constant returning to the same motifs in Jenny and Dwayne's work. The collaborative, or kind of commie idea that they've brought back to the West Coast. So, okay, and so I'm thinking those are really interesting conjectures, because those are all of those are conjectures based on a certain kind of continuity. Dora introduces this notion of history as if we're in a continuity with history, and that's true. The thing we are is not in a continuity in the same key with history. And this is the point. For example, she's asking about structures and ornaments as if what was structure then stays at the same place, and what was ornament then stays at the same place, or what was an unfinished work then stays at the same place, in taking up Hernan's theme. And I just went through a little bit of the history of the prototype. And let me point out to you that one of the hallmarks of modernism, the fingerprint of modernism, what a fingerprint of modernism means is how you know it, how you feel modern. I'm not talking about modernism as a style in the arts or modernism as a style in painting. I'm talking about how you know you're modern, is the coming to awareness of the power of ineptitude. Meaning, when modern self-conscious practice recognized that mistakes and poor craftsmanship or erroneous spellings or poor grammar or letting your paint slip or drip or making a bad error in any sense whatsoever carried with it a deep and powerful potential for your expert practice, and started to incorporate that power into the work. It began, for example, with Manet as a self-conscious act. He would leave parts of the canvas unpainted. He would also make mistakes, sort of. Then we would go back and discover lots of other people did that before, and then we really liked those paintings. It turns out Franz Hals was really lazy by the time he was old, and he would just do like this to finish a painting because he just was 80 years old, tired, wanted to get done, and now he loved those parts because he just was lazy and finished the painting. So the idea of ineptitude as an asset in our technique is part of continuity, but it's a change, missing notes, feedback. Jimi Hendrix's feedback. The history of the 20th century is not only, it's called the period of the counterintuitive, the uncertainty principle, but it's actually a celebration of the power of ineptitude. And it goes on in the arts and sciences all the time, and it's a pretty interesting thing. And you're not going to see a whole lot of ineptitude in their work. They don't really, you don't see it as much as you see it in Frank Gehry's work, or Wolf Pricks yelling last week about what we need to do is draw a perfect circle and then screw it up by drawing it again with a piece of wood. I don't know if you were here, but all that stuff about. So, I'll show you some films in a second. I'll tell you what I'm looking for. And what I'm looking for is my job, and what I would like to identify myself is not to figure out what the architect is thinking and tell it to you. My job is not to translate the architect's intentions or thoughts for you. They do it pretty well for themselves today, and if they don't do it for themselves, that's too bad. They can find someone else to do it, usually a graduate student. My job is not to judge it, good or bad. This person is doing good for the world, this person is doing bad for the world. That is about the stupidest thing I think anyone could do, period. It's particularly stupid in the arts. I don't think artists owe any explanation of their work to anybody except to the person that they're talking to whose work is similar to theirs. I don't think a country musician, actually Dwayne, do you call yourself, what do you call it, bluegrass? What do you, bluegrass. He's a bluegrass musician, plays the mandolin? Guitar. He plays some stuff with strings. You know, he may enjoy speaking to a jazz saxophone player as one musician to another, but they're not going to have a lot to say to each other, but he's going to speak to another mandolin player intensely, and he's going to pay attention to what they're doing. They're going to learn a lot from each other, and they're both going to grow. And so they're going to enter into a dialogue of exchanging techniques and projective discourse and evaluative discourse. No one else is going to be part of that conversation, and no one else belongs in that conversation, and nobody from the outside has got anything to say to them, and they got nothing to say to the outside. That's what I believe is the case. If you watch the Ricky Jay special on magic, he went around the country, met every great magician, and became the world's greatest magician in America. He doesn't care if you get it or not. You know, I don't believe that. So I don't believe in any of that juridical part. I do believe, however, that there is something I can do, and I'll explain it to you in a minute, and that has to do with feeling our changes in being in the world because of the work of artists, and particularly the work of architects. So I'm showing you this picture, and I'm going to ask you this question: what's wrong with this picture? Because for me, there's something wrong with this picture, and I don't mean they need to fix it. I mean, I can't get over it. There's something I can't get right with this picture. And I have to get right with this picture, you know, and we'll figure that out. Eventually, I can get right with stuff. I couldn't get right with video art in galleries for almost 15 years. Just the way they confiscated attention from other forms of art. They were so greedy for attention. They took so much time, they lit up. You walked into a gallery, I was used to seeing sculpture, I was used to seeing paintings, I was used to seeing passive forms of art. Video art lit up, took whole rooms. I had to stand there and watch it. It got to tell me when to start, it got to tell me when to end. I resented it. I resented the power it exercised over me. It took me forever to get over it. And then it took me even longer to not only get over it, and what it took to get over it is just feel like I could ignore it. Say, fuck you, I'm not, you know. Whoever let you in here, that's their problem. I'm not even gonna look at you. You know, I had to be like my dad for a while, which just made myself look at it. Now I like it. You know, I like it, and I like the power of it, and I like the way it competes with paintings and stuff. Okay, so they moved to town. Okay, and what I'm saying is, what's wrong with this painting and what's wrong with this picture is still wrong here, still at work here. It gets a little better here, not so bad, and it's not so bad for reasons I can explain with no trouble. And it's fine here. So I got it. This is a miracle. I'm only showing you this because I just want you to know miracles happen. There's nothing particularly fantastic about it. It is fantastic, but the miracle is everything. This was done for $2,500. This is just, these guys moved to town from the East Coast. They have to get it. They get a job doing a loft. It is a beautiful piece of, I won't call this minimalism or modernism. It's the most you can do for $2,500. That's what I think. I think it would be really unfair to call these minimalist architects. And, yeah, they're working in wood. It's deeply impressive. You can't buy a chair for $2,500. They made everything themselves. Of course, they still make everything themselves. And, you know, it's got an incredible sense of proportion and composition. I don't know if it's the best thing ever of this kind, but I just want you to know you can do good work for $2,500, and I also want you to know don't ever do it. It's just a waste of time and money. But to get started, it's pretty damn good. Getting those big things to stand out there like this for the photographs, that was really good. Was that Gumby? Who was the client? Was it some? Oh, so you did it for yourself. Okay. So at least you made the whole fee. You made the whole fee, or you netted the whole place. I want you to, so then this is a real client though, right?
This was Jenny's parents.
Okay, there you go. This is the way it works. You know. This is the only reason you should ever work in wood, in my opinion. You only work in wood because your parents want it and it's cheap. I've never, because, so this was their first client. They've solved problems and they did what you do when you first started. They moved, did you go to Cooper? You didn't go to Cooper.
No, I taught a little there.
You taught there, but both of you went to the GSD, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so these are GSD guys, moved out here, decided to become Californians, and now they look like it. And then, according to what I could figure out from everything they sent me, they went this, this, and this. Perfectly logical progression of, yeah, okay. So having done that, having done those two things, they finished all wood and decoration, and then they were ready to do this. And I thought, and they jumped immediately to their mature style in one day. That was an amazing event, I think. So they did this, they knew better. They assumed everybody in Los Angeles was a complete idiot structurally, so they called this a cantilever, but they knew better, and so they put it in exclamation points. And what's fantastic is that this is genuinely the birth of almost their mature style, and that is all of the elements of weaving, the tubular steel, cabling, and working out how to delimit space. It also is the place where I need to stop and start to think, you got to ask yourself, what is the architectural point of this? And from this point, you should have no problem whatsoever knowing the architectural point of this, right? It has a quality of space, it has a quality of repose, it is a familiar architectural set of effects that requires no critical positioning. Is that fair? Does anybody need someone to explain to them how to listen to this record? I would call this easy listening. This isn't easy listening, It's not art, but it's clearly, for example, the photographs don't really suggest you're supposed to do anything but look at it. You're supposed to stand there, pay very close attention to it. There's nothing about it that invites you in, sit down, enjoy the shade. Notice how filled with happy people it is. So what are its performances? And this is the question I really want to ask you now. So I'm going to take a second and I'm going to show you 3 film clips. Because what I'm trying to do for myself, for you, and my teaching, and what I'm going to die on is go back to this question: is how do we collect architectural performances? And so I've just picked out 3. One of the best ways for me to identify and distill and present an architectural performance is not through the work of an architect. but through the work of somebody else who's actually identified an architectural performance, in particular as an architectural performance, not as a building performance, but in the sense that it's actually architecture, and in the sense not just a quotidian building, like going inside a door, outside a door. There's a fantastic scene in Red River with John Wayne and Montgomery Clift. I don't know if you know Montgomery Clift, one of the great actors of the 20th century, great method actor, gay it turns out, but he's John Wayne's son on a cattle drive, and there's a big conflict, Freudian conflict between the father, and anyway. They're sleeping out under the sky for 6 months. I know I'm going on and on. This is gonna be short, don't worry about it. I'm going out for 6 months, and they walk in this bar, and all the cowhands are, the roof is pretty high. Let's say it's high as that thing. All the cowhands bend over like this. They come up to the bar, and the bartender says, "Yeah, what's your problem?" He says, "Man, when you're sleeping out under the stars, that roof really weighs heavy on you, you know." And they sit there and they take a few drinks and they stand up straight and it's all over. Next scene, John Wayne's going like this, going like this, and his girlfriend said, "What's going on?" He says, "Well, man, I got a real load on my mind." And you're thinking, okay, he's internalized the weight of that building and he expresses it in the metaphor, "I got a load on my mind." And I could show you that, and I think that's interesting. I think the metaphor of having a load on my mind, or feeling the weight of the building now sublimated into his psyche, is something I could show you as a building effect. But I want to show you architectural effects. So I'm going to show you 3 effects, and we're going to try to think about collecting architectural performances. And then I'm going to say, when I say something's wrong, it's when I see performances, 2 performances that can't go together at the same time, but an architect is asking us to put them together at the same time. So here's the first one, my favorite. There it is. Okay. West.
In times long past, this planet was the home of a mighty and noble race of beings, which called themselves the Krell. Ethically, as well as technologically, they were 1,000,000 years ahead of humankind. For in unlocking the mysteries of nature, they had conquered even their baser selves. And when in the course of eons they had abolished sickness and insanity and crime and all injustice, they turned, still with high benevolence, outward toward space. Long before the dawn of man's history, they had walked our Earth and brought back many biological specimens.
I see. That explains the tiger and the deer.
The heights they had reached. But then, seemingly on the threshold of some supreme accomplishment, which was to have crowned their entire history, this all but divine race perished in a single night. In the 2,000 centuries since that unexplained catastrophe, even their cloud-piercing towers of glass and porcelain and adamantine steel have crumbled back into the soil of Altair 4, and nothing, absolutely nothing, remains above ground.
What were they like?
No record of their physical nature has survived, except perhaps in the form of this characteristic arch. I suggest you consider it in comparison to one of our functionally designed human doorways.
Isn't that great? One of our functionally designed human doors. Now, every time somebody walks through that door, it's pretty true. That rectangle and those proportions say something about the human body, and particularly in the house. And it also says something about, like, why is it when you go through a cathedral, are there gigantic doors? And the answer is really simple, because a cathedral needs to be ready just in case a really big guy, like a 15, 20-foot guy that's 18 feet wide comes through, or there is an effect to a large door that is other than just the proportional things. But the great thing about this story is if you listen carefully and you watch the end of the movie, 2 things you find out. One is they never represented themselves. They left no record of, no pictures of themselves, no discussions of their bodies, no no art, no literature, no representations of themselves at all. Plus, the epic achievement was they built a computer so they could deposit their minds in a computer and leave their bodies. Not that they hated their bodies, but the computer was going to give them the power to do things that their bodies limited them from doing. But what they didn't realize is that when they put their minds in their body, they not only put their egos in the computer, they also put their id, their Freudian id in the computer. And in one night, in a gigantic orgy of sex and passion and murder and eating a whole lot, they killed themselves. They wiped themselves out in one night. So, the question is, does that characteristic arch actually reflect their body? And the answer probably is, we don't know. We have no way of knowing. If it does, they probably look like Teletubbies, I guess, whatever would fit through there. But more likely, since they were a million years ahead of us, they were not so knee-jerk in their relations. But the great thing I think about this is whoever wrote that scene thought a lot about architecture, knew something about the difference between architecture and building, knew that there was a theory of representation, semiotics built into architecture, and that paying attention to it was different than not paying attention to it, and not paying attention to it was encoding that message in you over and over and over and over again. And so he understood something about architecture's power to construct a subjectivity in relationship. So the architect knows it, we are the subjects that he or she constructs. And so that's a kind of close attention, and that's one of the performances of architecture. Another one of the performances, this is the one, you often hear this around this school, but I don't think anyone really quite understands what they mean by the sublime. Oftentimes you'll hear, I'm after the sublime, but what's the difference between the sublime in architecture and the sublime when someone like Burke or the other guy, Kant's mentioning the sublime, or the sublime of the landscape? And here is an example of the sublime in architecture.
Have you ever seen anything like that before? Didn't know men could build such things.
Oop. Now, I'll run it for you one more time. This is from The Gladiator. Now, Ridley Scott made The Gladiator, which is a telling of the story of Moses without any God in it, just a test run before he went ahead and did it again as Exodus.
Have you ever seen anything like that before? Didn't know men could build such things.
Now, anybody, y'all see the movie? Okay, if you saw the movie, you know what happens is Russell Crowe, took me 3 years to get Russell Crowe permission to use that image, really, 3 years. And before the film opened at a film festival, I didn't know what to do because I couldn't get it. I finally called Frank and said, look, I just can't get it. He said, let me see what I can do. Next morning, I get a call from Australia. Jeff, this is Russell. No problem. I sent the fax. We should have called me earlier. Okay. I lost your number, Russell. Sorry. Then I got the fax and a bill for $10,000. Literally. So they've just come in. Russell Crowe is returning. He's Moses returning. He just can't wait to kill the guy that kicked him out. There's all the slave. Jaimin Hanchu, the guy who says, I had no idea man could build such things, has just, he and the other slaves have never been to Rome before. A lot of the other guys are watching flame eaters, jugglers. They're fascinated by other people. But he's the only one that's fascinated by the Colosseum. And then he says, I had no idea man could build such things. Now, Ridley Scott, the three directors I'm showing you, are particularly attentive to architecture. And one of my problems today is directors are less and less and less so, but Ridley Scott is very good. Hitchcock is extremely good, so is Kubrick. I mean, there are a lot of them. But you find it less and less and less. But in this case, from those of you who remember your literature class, why do you imagine that scene is there? Why would he even put the scene there? It's a little bit like asking, why would they put the scene about the Krell in the other one? I mean, this is a fantastic way to seek out architectural performances, because that isn't a clear piece of architectural performance. That's not a building performance. Anybody have an idea why it's there? Because it's at that moment the slave realizes that men do things he had no idea he could imagine, and that's why later on, when he has to fight to set himself free, he realizes he can do something he never imagined he could do. It foreshadows his ability to rise above himself and to seek powers and to seek abilities he never imagined he could do, and that becomes the basis of the story. And so this idea that we can discover, not just, this is a Hegelian idea, we can discover new things that we are from outside ourselves. Not everyone will discover it from architecture, but some of us discover it from architecture. And I believe that most of us that are in the discipline have done that. That's why we're here in some way or another. And that's why I don't think architecture is for everybody. It's film for some. I have friends in dance that absolutely believe dance changes the world, that dance is the entire universe. You know, the same thing for poets. I mean, do you know anyone who has a smaller audience in architecture than poets? I mean, they are their audience. That's it. Poets are the audience of poetry, period. I mean, that's it. That's kind of, and yet philosophers call poetry the most important art form. So the last one I'm going to show you is, I think, the one, all three of these I think you can see. So that is a kind of spectacle, that is stopping and looking at a piece and having it stop you in your tracks just for its difficulty to imagine how it got there in a way that you could never have imagined. These are effects that I think you're seeing in Dwayne and Jenny's work, and they're incongruent. And this is the one I think they would like to be there. They speak about it being there. I don't know, this is my favorite, by the way.
You know, there was a time once when we almost had it made, just the two of us. He was in a fever about some new project up in Alaska, a hunting lodge for tourists. It was going to make us a fortune, better than a gold mine. But most of all, it was going to be something we never had before. A real home. We got it built too, just him and me, side by side. The day the roof was finished, he danced all over it. I never was so happy in all my life. It was a beautiful home. But no tourists ever came. Nobody. We just lived there, all alone in that big, empty failure. Till he couldn't stand the sight of me. I think it happened. I was eating a biscuit. He started yelling what a greedy, selfish bastard I was. Yelling and yelling until I grabbed his throat. I couldn't stop myself. He tore loose, got a gun. He said, "Look at me, boy. Take a good look, because I'm the last living thing you're ever going to see." And he pulled the trigger. But the gun wasn't loaded. He began to cry. All like a kid. I went for a long walk. When I got back, the place was dark. The door was locked. All my stuff was piled outside in the snow where he threw it. I walked away and never looked back. I guess the only thing I'm gonna miss in this world is that poor old man and his hopeless dreams.
I'm glad you don't hate your father anymore.
But I do. I hate him. And I love him.
Okay, how do you, that seems like a building effect. Window. There's two very complex working architecture. There's architecture as a place you play, there's buildings that you place your dreams for the future in that fail. Cedric Price's famous line to married couples, you don't need a new building, you don't need a new house, you need a divorce. And there's the fact that as he's telling the story about his father, this is a psychopath who's totally unable, who's committed murder, and he's totally unable to feel any feelings whatsoever, any emotions. And in the book, he feels none whatsoever. This is a book by Truman Capote, famously written about psychopaths in such a way as to not give them any emotions or any internal life whatsoever. But the filmmaker decides to use a really interesting cinematographic effect, and that is he lets the rain on the window cry for the Robert Blake, for the murderer. Robert Blake later on actually murders his wife in real life. I don't know if you know this, and is now serving a life sentence. And it's a deeply powerful movie, but you could say, well, that's not an architectural effect, that's just a regular building effect. What stops it from being a regular building effect? Anybody that's a student, any architect should know this in a second. What's wrong with that as a building effect? Why would it only be an architectural effect? It's actually only a cinematographic effect. How many of you own your own house? That's good. This probably is not a question that actually works that well in California now that I think about it. Let's say you go home, it's raining, and you see that much water on your window. Are you happy about that? Or is there something really wrong with your house? So if you got that much water on your window, you need to call someone right away. That is like a major building failure. And in fact, what happened was the lighting guy put up a fan to cool the lights, and it blew the water on the window. It was a mistake. A kid set a fan up, and it blew the water, and he thought he ruined a shot. They fired him, and then when they did the dailies, they loved the effect so much. So it started, like often is the case, it started off as an effect. It's an incredible, so you saw the tears coming down on Robert Blake's eyes. Okay, so now let me point out to you that what you can't do is tell everybody to watch that in the beginning. You can't do the Krell thing and the Robert Blake. You can't call close attention to it and have it operate in the background at the same time. A soundtrack cannot work if it's so loud you're paying very close attention to it. It cannot work if it's so soft you don't pay any attention to it at all. It has to stay in a level of distracted attention. So all of these performances require a certain measuring of where it is in attention. And that's how they gain their power. So we call this the spectrum of attention. And so oftentimes when I'm confronted with something is when I see works of architecture trying to compete with themselves on levels of performance of attention. And that's kind of where I'm going to go with this discussion of this work. But anyway, as we're going through Dwayne and Jenny's work, let me just call out, let me ask you to pay attention to what are the performances? What is the architectural performance? We know the architectural rationale. They make it very clear, and I think it's obvious. And we know the resources. in other words, what its architectural justification is, what its mandolin playing is in relationship to another mandolin player, I think is very clear. What its goal as architecture is less obvious, and it doesn't actually need one yet. So they get there is a really funny comedy that goes on through this entire thing, and that's the ongoing in-joke about the Taiwan high-rise, and I'll just leave it to you to follow. So this is, they get a chance to design a high-rise in Taiwan, and here's the beginning of the joke. But notice, I mean, it's, you know, it's a pretty good high-rise, and then there's really a lot of attention to the materiality. They're always trying. This is one of my favorite projects. They're asked to do this hanging system for the gallery, for Los Angeles Architecture and Something Gallery. The brief specifically says, we need to put it up and take it down because the space is shared by the gallery and a college that uses the space. And it specifically says right here, it has to be moved from the space and stored when not in use. Now, they basically say, that's wrong. Okay, anything of real, I guess I look at it, I bold, anything of real art, I bold the wrong thing. I should have bolded their philosophy. Gotta read their philosophy. Anything of real architectural value within the space should be an integral and constant part of the experience of the space. Now, they state that as a truth, which is what a passionately felt conviction of value should be. So the challenge came, you know, in other words, they said, no architect should ever put something that should be taken in and removed. There are many architects that would have thought that would have been a really interesting challenge, but they considered that to be an assault on their sense of architectural value, and that gives us a clue. I find that really interesting. It also says something like that's, for me, a challenge to one of the issues. Like, one of the problems in architecture is no matter how good it is, it's because of its temporality and its duration, it's a relentless, fatiguing presence. And so there are many architects today that experiment with how do you withdraw the architectural conceit. Nouvelle is one, Herzog and Nimmer, in other words, how do you give a lot of architectural impact and then let go completely? And in other words, it's called the end of the synthetic project. For 400 years, for a long time, every element, plan, section, materiality, detail, construction, tectonics, all had to be coordinated into a symphonic whole and be present throughout the building in the service of the synthetic paradigm. Now, because of our attention span, because of you guys looking at your iPhones at the dinner table, there's so many demands on of attention, the presence of an architectural conceit, the relentless presence of an architectural conceit, is at least openly a question about whether that's a continued worthwhile value. You know, for me, music is like, I can't stand it because I like to listen to music with all the time closely. I need it to be off most of the time. Most people don't care, but I need most of the time music to be off. I don't like restaurants with music on. I would rather listen to the gigantic noise of a loud bunch of people than any music in a restaurant. So this is an interesting question, but they're definitely saying not only should it be there, but it needs to be present. And it's clearly present. And it got so present that when Wes Jones broke it, I don't guess they've spoken to them since, and Wes had to leave the school. Here's a staircase whose job is supposed to get you from the, you know, I'm not gonna, you know these projects, so I don't feel like I need to explain these projects to you. But the curiosity of this project is, the brilliance of this project is to understand that it has 3 discrete tectonic elements in its tradition, and that is to ask if those projects, if they're interwoven, could the staircase be rethought? So can I take the stair, the handrail, the structural system, the riser, I forget, and the umamoto. What are the parts of a stair? Riser and tread, yeah, I knew it wasn't. If I can take the 3-part or 4 parts of it and instead treat them as one continuous, not a single surface, but as one continuous system, what comes of it? And there are other people who have done studies about the behaviors of the parts. For example, Scarpa uses the change from steel to wood at the Quattro Familia stamp collection-y, whatever that museum is in Venice. So as you're walking down that bridge, he changes the change of the feel from coolness to warmth as you go from the water side to, he uses the change in materiality to change the feeling to actually welcome you inside the gallery. It's an incredible effect if you know it. So as you go from metal to wood, as you know, the temperature doesn't change, but the feeling of cool to wood because of the transmission of the, anyway, you don't know thermodynamics. According to Michael Bell, Le Corbusier uses the different structural systems of 2 different structures on the side of a tread and a staircase to change the behavior of a stair. All of this work to change the relationship and no behavioral consequences or no claim to any behavioral consequences, just the claim to have done it and to showing it. As far as I know, I couldn't find any. And then to look at the people forced to endure it is what I see in these photographs of the people. There's not my sense of the people, the sense of, it's true that people can go up and down there, but there's one, see him? There's a person. So the interest is not so much what are the consequences, but the exercise of the work itself. It's, for me, absolutely pure architecture, pure music playing, needs no excuse, needs no apology, but has yet to think of the problem of the performance other than the purity of its architectural thinking. And this gets to only to be a problem at when another scale starts to become. Okay, here's the next step. Here's Taiwan Tower number 2. Okay, we still haven't built one yet, so we're gonna try again. We're gonna do it with a little more integrity. We're gonna be a little bit less appeasing. And so what we're gonna do is put our own work in, speaking for them, and we're just gonna put our, what we do up, and we're gonna forget that we're covering up all the balconies. And so we don't sell anything, they don't build this one. So then we just move on. There's number 3. Notice that, okay, we better not cover up the balconies quite so much. Doesn't get built, right? Okay, so, okay. That's, now, the only reason I show this is, this has produced one of the funny jokes in my life as I was studying their work. I go visit them, this is their house. They built this, what do you call it now, wall, gate. I go to their house, I have a delicious dinner, too much to drink. We talk a long time, have a fantastic night. I'm backing out, and I hit this incredible handmade jewel of a fence with my car. And I break the mirror on my car, $800 damage. And as I'm backing out, I think, they're gonna kill me. And I meet Andy on the way to the airport, and I said, they're gonna kill me. And he said, they're gonna kill you. I bet Jenny and Dwayne sue you. They love that gate so much, I'm sure they're calling their lawyer right now. So anyway, that's what they, so the reputation was, they're not worried about your car. Which, by the way, now this is my favorite project, or this is the project that leads to my favorite project. At this point, you're starting to see the tectonic thinking and the affective thinking come into a proportional relationship where the behavior of the way you pay attention to it and the scale of the materiality and the scale of the construction interest, it's almost impossible not to pay attention to this thing correctly, or in the way that I would say is working well. So as far as I'm concerned, there's nothing wrong with this picture, except for the slight idea that one recognizes the type of the bench. One doesn't recognize any typology, so it stays poised right between something you pay attention to, like the cantilever, except not so close attention to it that you're seeing it like in the Sublime, but you're kind of seeing it a little bit like the rain on the wall. It's slightly hypnotic. It's not grabbing you and stopping in your feet. It has a quality about it that's more mesmerizing than it is, like the Colosseum. But the chair is in a different key. You see what I'm saying? You read it differently, and it's very hard to reconcile with it too, but not so bad that you let it go, because it belongs in the same world. There's a chair and there's a wall of some sort. They don't belong in different worlds. It's beautiful. I really think it's a fantastic piece, and it was done for Dwell magazine. I don't know. Notice, they just can't get the people in these things to matter. Much as they try. I'm sorry to say this. I know you're thinking this is critical. I don't mean that to be critical. So you're trying to make them look like they're moving and that they care and that they're sitting around on it. They just don't matter. They don't matter to you. They don't matter to me. This is my favorite project by far. I don't know. Someplace I've had this called Anemone, or maybe it was just mislabeled on one thing, or someplace it's called
IAC, it's the company IAC.
IAC. Okay, it just was, yeah. This is not a piece of plastic. This is now the behavior of this thing at a scale where I think the proportions and materiality would be perfect. And the lines allow a whole gradient of attention, and it's working as a facade. And so it's demands for occupation. Everything is great. I mean, I really think if this thing had been built, a whole other dimension would have entered to their practice life. However, they're now beginning to face the problem that Liz Diller and Rick Scafidio did, and that is they're trying to scale up incrementally, and it's a disaster for any practice. You really have to start having ideas and practicing on multiple scales simultaneously very early in your work, because you're going to see pretty soon they're going to have to try to, right now, they're skinning boxes because that's what they are faced with, because there's no internal materiality. They do a smart thing. This is this cube thing. I showed it just because I really love how the color, it's not particularly of interesting to me. What's particularly of interesting to me is they did these as drawings, sent them to China, and China built them overnight. But it's kind of neat. Here, there's more tower. So now they're actually behaving themselves, and not as behaving themselves as well as they did on the first tower, which was too well, but now they're behaving themselves better. Is this one going to get built? Oh, it's being built. They finally got one built. So you really got to try to get built. Has it got good plans and stuff? I never saw any plans. Are they good?
We did do the plans.
There you go. That's how you do it. Anyway, I like that running story of the towers. Now, at their house, they realize you do not build stuff in your house that people can run into. So you build canopies, which I thought was quite smart. This is a wonderful house in Spain, and I really love this house because they are forced to work and plan. Forced to work in a dialogue between massing and plan. They start to introduce incongruous elements that are harmonic with the work. So everything you're looking at belongs, in a sense, to the attitude about the weaving tectonics, but not really. For example, there's nothing particularly that the massing belongs to that. It's just not incongruent with it. And so the fin and the single surface L, it's a familiar enough language that they're totally harmonic. And so when you get to the interior on the inside, that little vortex is fine. It doesn't really belong. It hasn't come from anywhere else, and it really is a very nice piece of architecture. It sort of belongs to a familiar idiom that they're able to adopt their signature and their expertise to a familiar idiom in a context where it belongs nicely and get a really nice piece out of it, which luckily allows the next two things to happen. They do this competition, which I think is the Taichung competition, and now they're faced just with their weakness, I think, and that is they do a pretty good analysis, they do good massing, but in the end, what they can bring to the problem a lot with any expertise and any sense of architecture is the skin, and the skin really has no performance for it yet. It's not intensely performative in relationship to the proposal. That's what I would say. But they are able to take that thing and do that, which actually doesn't particularly belong or not belong. It's just got bigger, you know. And then this happens, which I think is just great. Great piece of luck. Guggenheim, the Guggenheim in Helsinki. And their idea for the Guggenheim is to riff on the Guggenheim from the point of view of their own work, which is just a great piece of luck because their own work, which has to do with taking the drapery stuff from the earlier work, allows them to totally read the Guggenheim as belonging to, like the Guggenheim hit by winds. It's beautiful. And then this thing now is totally part of it. And so there's this kind of great way of waiting for, I don't know, luck, you know. It had no chance of winning, I can tell you that whatsoever. But it does really do something wonderful. And then to allow that to adapt to the infrastructural issues that were built into the Helsinki Guggenheim. So this was a fantastic, good thing for them. I don't know if you ever thought it had a chance. Because I now have all 1,700 entries on the wall and stuff. It's part of, you know, all my kids are doing. But as something that helped you solve a problem and moved you that, I mean, I don't know if you're going to stay with that, but it was a kind of major leap, and so I think it was great to see for me. And so I just want to go back to this last little thing that we touched on, and that is, I find this problem, this solution, which was the Netscape solution, totally consumable, totally for me. Everything about this was good, meaning there were no incongruities for me at all. But this, because of the cartoon quality of that drawing, I cannot make it belong in the same reality as the tectonic drawing. You know, I love architectures that are exploring that, and I love architectures that are exploring the tectonics. As soon as you put the fabric on it, and there's no color on it, it's a little better. As soon as you put the color on it, it becomes ornament and structure, just like Dora was saying, and I get more comfortable with it because there's a part that's permanent and there's a part that's frivolous, and it gets easier and easier and easier. But that, which is really challenging for me, requires me to have two forms of attention, two forms of ontology at the same time. And I'm interested in that, but even though you work out the metal and the drawing, I just cannot reconcile those as, it's a little bit like Who Framed Roger Rabbit. I cannot have the cartoon and the reality in the same world and have that be reconcilable performances for me. And that's what I mean by what's wrong with that drawing. And I know that the problem is not it or mine, it's mine. And that's what I thought I would end. So there we go.
This is the same guy who's been telling us for so long that we should not take ourselves so seriously. And suddenly we do a cartoon, and that's where he can't figure it out.
I don't mean for you not to do a cartoon. I mean for me to figure out. You wouldn't have done a cartoon. I thought about this, for example. You wrote something really interesting. You rarely get a chance to have a second chance to do a work better. You know, which is a kind of dumb thing to write.
I didn't use the word better, but.
I think you did.
No, you rarely get a second chance.
To improve your work?
To improve, I did say improve, yeah.
Okay. You could have said something like, to hope you improve. I mean, you could have. Right. But anyway.
Because it's presumptuous that we did improve?
Well, I mean, as I understood the work, it was a last minute, no budget. I mean, it was not anywhere near as endowed as the first work. And so.
No, that's not true, but the situation in the office had changed pretty dramatically since the first one. So, no, actually, the later one, I think each one of them cost more, but our ability to do them as an office had just changed.
And so, just to be honest with you, when I first saw it, and when I first thought about this talk, and when I first looked at that stuff, I thought that was just a capitulation to the environment of SCI-Arc, that you had done a rigorous y'all's work, and that it was, not cynical or anything or lazy. It was just kind of a capitulation, like more color, more recognition that there's another idiom. It was more generous. I don't mean it to be in anything other than, and partly because you just weren't interested in the project so much anymore. So you might as well do something SCI-Arc-y as opposed to Oyler Wu or Wooey. Right. And then the more I studied it, the more work as I studied it, I realized how much work you had to put into to do it. It was just as hard, is what I'm saying. Mm-hmm. I didn't realize that. Mm-hmm. And then I noticed you started using the color issue in the cube. I know you didn't do that, but that you'd sent the lighting scheme. Right. I started to think, okay, they're really dealing with this. And then when I looked at the Guggenheim, you are actually trying to expand your vocabulary rapidly because you don't want to face the problem that Liz and Rick face. And they probably went through 15 years of actually just having to rip people off. I mean, because they had the big buildings. There was no time really to develop their own work. You're going to go through an imitative period anyway. Everybody does period. There's no way to avoid that. And so this is very clear. I thought it became really interesting to me that you're going to experiment with things that could belong to that might be able to grow into your repertoire.
Absolutely. No, I think we've been really open about saying that we know we're facing that problem, and we feel super lucky. On one hand, we've been able to make a jump, so we don't think we're gonna struggle with houses for 20 years that helped us grow. But the bad news is you do have to make an incredible leap that we've been open about saying we're kind of worried about that. Mm-hmm. So these competitions was specifically us saying we better get working on that problem because if we continue to be as fortunate as we have, the problem's
we spent about 10 years not doing any we actually spent the first 5 years of our kind of collaborative doing 10 competitions. And then we realized that's not how we wanted to work. And then we spent 10 years not doing any competitions. And it's only until now, and while we were doing all these Type A projects, that we realized we don't want to only do skin projects. And that were the only, kind of projects we were getting. And then we think it's a matter of time when we actually have to do these bigger projects, and how do we get to think about, more than the first 5 foot of space. And so we started the last 2 years working on these competitions. Mainly, as you said, it's not about, us, we had any chance of winning, but it's really about how do we actually work on this project, and from how does this surface start to kind of come together with all the line work that we were doing before?
There's a huge misconception among young architects who get out and they spend, many of my friends and friends that we all have that get out and they spend the first 10 years and they think, I'll build my way up to something interesting. And a couple years in, they've got a small kind of interesting thing, and someone else hires them to do a thing that's a little bigger, but it's also kind of interesting. And the next thing you know, they've become a mediocre architect. It's not necessarily doing bad buildings, but never did anything interesting. And we started feeling like we were doing really interesting things in the installations, but the development work, while we're proud of it, it's not going at it with the same kind of approach.
No, I know. I mean, 10 PA Design Awards for Morphosis, no significant building. It's roughly the same for Wes. You know, I mean, then you get typecast. You know, Neil sort of worked it out or got lucky. I mean, the stuff, his trips to Japan, I mean, Neil combined ambition and luck, I think, but he could easily ended up with LA Iworks forever.
Yeah. Yeah.
But because he built those banks in Japan and wasn't able, they were a little bit bigger, and then he got the advertising agency. But I mean, I really do think you have to start mixing it up quickly and earlier, mostly because you need a language in place, and you need the language to. I don't really believe that much that it has to be coherent. It's just you're going to go through an imitative phase, period, because there's no way not to, whether you're, period, any artist, you just can't not. Even if you decide to make up a sentence that no one's ever said before, that first sentence is going to be the sentence that everyone makes up to make up that no one's ever said before. It is. I mean, it's just one of the great things about, you know, I mean, and that's the fun of it. So you want to do that when falling down doesn't hurt as much.
Yeah.
Like when Liz and Rick did that the first time, it was all over the New York Times. You know, so you don't want to have won 4 awards and already been called a MacArthur grant and all that sort of stuff, you know. So, and now they're over it. I mean, you know, you can like the work or not like the work, but they're not dealing with that anymore. They're just dealing with, I don't like this work, or, you know, the road sucks, or what happened to that wall being structural.
Right.
And Liz says, you know, he didn't pay me, we made a fortune on it, so screw you. Which I think, do you like that answer?
Was that his answer?
No, she said, it's supposed to be structural, we sent him the bill, he said no, so we sent him half the bill, and it cost 1/10 as much money, so we just made a lot of money on it. You know, so it's not structural, sue us, we made more money. So I think, okay, they're now mature architects. So we'll go do a great building someplace else, you know. We're not going to fight the biggest asshole in history and lose over a structural wall.
Right.
But I think the other issue is, when you look at that, do you want to keep working on, do you see what I'm talking about? Like, you do a lot of drawings. You do a lot of drawings. And I went and looked at all those drawings. I look at your jewelry too. Your jewelry is complex enough that I could imagine a cartoon flower working in it. So I do think that, for example, the typology of the expectation of the form matters. Like, the bench is an interesting moment for me, because it's not as, there's a bookshelf, you know, that thing is not anything that is the display, which is part of its, you know, great power. What was it called? You had a name for it.
Screenplay.
Screenplay, but I mean, what was the competition?
Dwell originally just commissioned us because they wanted an installation at the convention center.
So I thought there were other people that was.
No,
No,
just
so
us.
they just commissioned you to do an installation?
Yeah.
And it wasn't for a screen or anything?
No, we could do whatever we wanted.
But you wanted it to have some furniture-like qualities, since you were assuming people would come there?
Well, it actually had a structural property that we actually never talked about, because at the convention center, you can never drill, you can't do anything to it. So the thing has to come in and assemble in 2 hours and has to withstand anyone who's shaking it. And so that kind of extra leg was actually just
I
making
see.
a
So it
tripod.
needed to stand
and-
up.
Yeah. But
Don't start telling, you don't have to defend it being a bench. I'm interested in it being a bench. I like it being a bench. You know, I like thinking about you know, it's really funny. If you call attention to something, people, you know, like.
Yeah. Well, I think there were a couple of things about that project that were important. It's important to know what we were coming off of when we did that. One of them was the Realize thing, the Muhammad Ali thing.
Right.
Where I think we were a little self-conscious about having done this project that many would evaluate its success based on whether or not you saw the face, and as you know, never a big interest for us. But part of it was a way of engaging the piece separate from the bench that picked up on some of the perceptual issues of the Ali piece, but in this case, a more abstract pattern. The second was a little bit, we had the structural problem, and we're thinking about the context of dwell on design, and the idea that we put a piece up there that might be appreciated as a bench at first, but for the reasons that probably interest you more, our hope was that the people would discover something, that they might sit in the bench thinking, oh, it looks like a comfortable place to sit, and a handful of them sat in it, never looked up at the piece, walked away, and bought some piece of modernist furniture. But I do think that because there was such an intimate form of engagement with the bench, the point was to kind of open up their interest to the thing that was ultimately more interesting to us than the bench.
But there's a kind of a funny story that, that very first project that you said, we went from the wood to the canopy.
Yeah.
We took pictures with no one in it, which was true. Like the way we saw the project was this kind of beautiful canopy piece, and we never really, it's about the effect of the lines and all the stuff. Those are things we thought about when we designed it. And then, the space is actually a very kind of, it's a thing where people go and hang out. And we remember this was more at the opening and then also at every event that happened on the space. We had pieces and and we thought people would be like what you said, look at it and be like, beautiful canopy. Instead, everybody kind of climbed on it. They were like lounging like this. They were lying down on like a canopy.
That's why I hate people.
They were trying to play it like a mandolin.
They were like trying to play it like a mandolin. And at first we were like, why are they doing that? Like, this is so like irreverent.
Don't they see the indexical qualities here?
No, I understand.
And then after a while, we actually got really like into it. We're like, wow, there's actually this interaction that then, gets people really engaged in the project that isn't so kind of like the pristine thing. And I think that's why we kind of brought that idea back when we thought, well, Dwell is a place where there are going to be a lot of people. We don't want it to be just something they just look at, but actually like, what if they become part of it? So.
Yeah. This is going back a little bit, but I'm really interested in this idea of the cartoon and what that meant. And you're bringing up a bunch of things. I don't know that we were super conscious of them at the time. We certainly, never said one to one another, let's be more SCI-Arc-y. But there is a kind of wackiness to it. We never thought of it as cartoony, but we did use the word wacky a couple of times. And our hope. And it's not a defense. It's more to say this was our intention, was that you might see that, and you might see it as even a commentary on the SCI-Arc work. Our hope was that you'd see that, and your first interpretation might be there's a little bit of wackiness here, but when you get into the piece a little bit more, and you actually discover that there literally was a tectonic value to the length of the wackiness, and you've read that, so you know. So if anyone doesn't know, the length of that piece at the bottom is equal to the perimeter of the cones at the top. And it solved a problem of not having to pattern. It may not interest you, but it was a real technical problem. And our hope was that on one hand, hearing that story, it sounds overly technical and kind of boring, but if you can make that leap from this wackiness also solving a tectonic problem, it painted it in a different light that allowed you to appreciate both its wackiness for it meaning nothing, and suddenly it did mean something. And if you look at a lot of the projects we've done, they've tried to bridge that gap between a thing that had seemingly no tectonic meaning to a thing that very much was about solving a tectonic problem in what we hope was a novel way.
But that's why, again, I'm trying to avoid, this is judgment, but this is judgment between one mandolin player and another.
Sure.
But I'm not really a mandolin player, but I do listen to a lot of it. Once you use fabric to negotiate that tension, and you put color on it, then you allow the hierarchy of color and non-permanent material and permanent material to alleviate the problem of the wackiness. In other words, when I'm looking at the thing I show you, when I say what's wrong with this picture, then the tension between the wacky and the direct performative structural issue is at its height. You know, these two things don't belong in the same world, but they must belong in the same world.
Because you don't see the curvature and the tension of the...
And you don't see the, and you don't further relieve it with a color. Once you put the fabric and the color in, then you relax me completely, and then whether I know that or not, I'm fine. You know, I'm kind of drunk. So I know that the strut is in the world, keeping me safe, straight, and carrying a load. And whether that thing is the right perimeter or not doesn't matter to me anymore, you know, because it's colored. I mean, it's ornamental. That's why I thought Dora's thing was very interesting. There's, like, when she says there's no ornament in your work, and all of a sudden there's two big kinds of ornament, one really interesting ornament that's not an ornament, and then another thing that's not really not an ornament, but that's acting like an ornament, alleviating the interesting ontological tension, which is really what I think is the architectural moment for me of really something interesting. You know, because I have been lecturing around, you see, it's nice that we're finally talking to each other and we forgot all about these guys. I've been lecturing around here about a real interest I have in multiple ontologies. Can architecture set out more than one ontology at the same time? You know, and I never have even known what that meant. And that's what I thought, well, this could be it, you know, and maybe I don't want to get it in the same world like a collage. Like the chair and the thing that could be a wall, could not be a wall, they could easily be in the same world for me, whether the connection's there or not. So I thought that there was a lot of promise there in how you negotiate that, you know, and then all the other stuff after that starts to get smooth. You know, the Guggenheim and, you know, I think we have to not, I'm discouraging more smoothing. I'm not encouraging, I'm encouraging more seams, not more parts. I mean, one of the beautiful things about LAI works that no one pays attention to is that when you walk in there, Neil introduced a whole lot of fake seams. I know you know it, because if you remember Colatan, when Bill and Strulon did all that super smooth stuff, it was so irreal, you just didn't care at all about it. So I'm sure what happened is he built all that stuff and it was doing exactly the same thing. So he just cut all these fake seams. They're fake. They're not tectonic locations.
Right, right.
And so that brings it back to having a sense of composition or put together.
Yeah.
That's totally not real, but allows it to work in the same way. And, you know, I mean, these are small things that make a big difference in terms of how it performs, you know. Yeah. But I don't actually think you need a theory of performance. You know, this idea that architects have to figure out what the performance is, you know, it's really not true. But it's either going to have a performance at the level of constructing a subjectivity or have some kind of performance, or it will just be a bridge to something else. I mean, that, you know, you don't know where you are. You know, you're either the teacher or the artist, or you're you know, you're either Hans Hofmann or Rothko. You never know where you're going to be, right? And you never know where your work is.
I don't know how to respond to that one.
Well, that's what I'm saying. So it's not about, you keep doing the work, but you have to keep, like, I don't really feel like I'm not asking you to make your own meta project. You know, but you're going to get asked, like, why am I supposed to stop and stand and look at this work? Like, it's amazing how many people stop and stand and look at Gary when that's exactly the wrong thing to do. You're supposed to look past Gary, but it's amazing how many people stop and stand and look at pricks when you are supposed to go inside. it's amazing how many people stop and stand and look at Eric when that's exactly what you're supposed to do. And when they don't get it, they don't realize that that's exactly what's supposed to happen. And that that's a good thing. I mean, you know, they don't understand that, like, when you go into Liebeskin's museum and you get lost, they don't think that that could possibly be a positive attribute of that space in that particular condition.
Mm-hmm.
This is the whole issue about, ineptitude. Like, not finding the front door was kind of inept architecture for a long time. And it probably inept architecture lots of times still. But, you know, if you want to make a museum where you don't want a grand entry, then making the front door, you know, then modulating the entry to the point of insignificance is a real achievement. And you have to do that with a kind of ineptitude. And, you know, you see them all over.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it could be as bad as the Renzo piano entry. Don't you think that staircase entry is terrible? That
Which one are we talking about?
Yeah. The red staircase
Oh,
entry.
right.
Or it can be like the Wexner Center, where you just can't find the entry, which is, you know, a lot of guys my age, the first time they get there, they really are pissed off about that. Like, they need to find the entry for all kinds of other reasons than getting inside the museum. So, you guys got any thoughts, questions? You always, you know, I tell you what, man, I love you. You are going to be SCI-Arc's first critic. We're going to turn you into, you know, Greg and I taught the 3 critics that came out of, you know, Nicholas, Urasov, Phil, I mean, some really jackass jerk critics came out of Columbia when we were teaching there, so we
have to hear what he has to say first.
Yeah. Don't you ask anything about the tool? No tool questions.
No, that one's done already.
Okay, that's good.
Well, I have a comment and a question, and I think, in a way, I've had both Jenny and Dwayne now as teachers, and I think it's interesting with the lecture series how it's always about kind of like SCI-Arc's effect on instructors, and I think with them too, it's more of the opposite. I think there was less of an impact onto them to create more SCI-Arc-y things, but I think the way they've done things kind of affected the way SCI-Arc approaches those things, like their installations kind of made everyone else want to realize their installations. So you kind of see it with Dwayne.
Well, you need to tell me more about that. I mean, I tried to avoid that topic this time, but like, how did their installations, I mean, because their installations were more real, like the staircase. Like the first installation was Andy's, the first installation of all, which is a bunch of big wood, and you could climb up. I mean, so that was the first one I knew you could negotiate from the floor up to the, so then, when was yours? In relation?
It was many after that,
Many
20
after-
after that or something.
Okay, so then tell me, were you here around for all those?
No, well,
I see, the first one in your lifetime, I see.
I think, yeah, when I was being taught by Jenny when the installation you first showed came up, and actually Dwayne's comment about it was actually my first question to Jenny, is how did you cut up the pattern, or how did you create a pattern for the installation? And she said, go look at it, I won't tell you. So Dwayne told me today, and I finally knew after so many years of wanting to know how it was done.
You mean you didn't figure it out yourself?
No.
See, you should be a critic. You're just a lazy student. The patience it takes to wait years to get an answer because you're too damn lazy to go figure it out for yourself is perfect.
I moved on. Anyway.
That's a good thing. I'm not saying anything bad about that. That's what I do.
My question would be for you guys is actually, I'm going to be a lazy student again and take the topic Eric and Jeff were talking about a couple of days ago about intuition. And I think being your student, we learn more seeing what you do and how you kind of react off the work in class, more than like what you have to say to Jeff. So in a way, it's kind of like this lecture series for you kind of demystifies what you've done, or you have to give an explanation for it, but I think what I'm interested in with you is how do you categorize your intuition and how you approach your work, especially considering there's two of you.
I don't know. The whole conversation about intuition is, it's funny that 25 years ago when I was in school, you know, a whole studio could be openly discussing that and embracing that as an issue. And now we're very uncomfortable, us included, talking about that. I think, I don't know that these are going to connect in a way that makes sense, but I think that our way of dealing with that intuition is we don't deny, and any architect who does deny that they're operating on some intuitive level is probably lying to you. But I think the fact that we're continuing to build on a thing we've done before, it's a way of kind of tempering our own intuition. You know, we're not sort of, hey, you know, my intuition told me this. Well, our intuition is usually telling us to work on a previous problem. What's making it inventive, I hope, is probably a little bit of intuition that I'm not sure we can entirely explain, but we don't deny is an important part of the way we work.
Yeah, you can't, first of all, you shouldn't speak of intuition as a thing. It's a set of feelings. And, you know, it doesn't show up as a thought or it wouldn't be an intuition. And it's as confusing as it is enlightening. It's a whole, you know, it's an apparatus. And, you know, it's like, there's no such thing as dead. You know, there's no thing dead. You know, it's a process. I mean, so I think the problem of it is discussing it as some reified, controllable mechanism. And it has many faces, and some of them are bad, some of them are good. But when you say 25, you're talking about when Mac, who did you have it?
An instructor, you probably don't know him, but I had an instructor named Robert Condia at Kansas State.
Oh, Kansas State.
Yeah, who was very much in.
But who did you have at the GSD?
We both had Mac together.
I mean, Mac,
actually.
Those stupid, I hate those damn things, but those briefs he would give were all about forcing you to have, making it impossible for you to do anything without some kind of leap of.
Yeah, or they're so outrageous, the sites and programs, that doing any kind of
there's no
solution based in logic was a disaster.
Yeah. See, I mean, I do think that's a fun thing to do. And if you have to make a guess that can't be grounded in logic, something has to come out. But I don't think that's intuition. I mean, I got this long letter from Dora about intuition doesn't have to be irrational or accidental or all that sort of stuff. I mean, you know, just intuition is just your body knowing something and your brain knowing something. It just didn't want to tell you straightforwardly. You know, like walking down a street for about 40 minutes and all of a sudden realizing your zipper's down. You know, which happens to me about 10 times a day. And then I read in Psychology Today that for men over 60, about 10 times a day, they discover their zippers down. You know, so it happens to you, and then you read it in Psychology Today, and you think, you know, shit, they do studies on that stuff. Right. Who knows?
Respond to something you said, but it's related to a point you brought up. On one hand, for you to say that, you know, SCI-Arc hasn't impacted us, and we've impacted it. Very kind of you. Thank you. But I think that the point you brought up about that density fields, the cantilever project coming fully formed, it really did. There wasn't a project in between those two.
No, I think it's, I mean,
there's no other explanation for that other than, wow, we spent a couple years at SCI-Arc and we're looking around going, are we really going where we want to go? And I think we thought, man, we need to make a big leap into something else. And that's the period that came out of.
I mean, there's no such thing as kind of wood, kind of steel, kind of nails, kind of cables. You know, there couldn't have been. And, you know, I went back and looked at some period work at the time to see if I could, you know, lab stuff was the easiest thing I could have shown some drawings in materials in space, and as a quick trick on the screen, it might have fooled them for a second, but it wasn't. I knew it wasn't that. So, But on the other hand, it's not the only work like that. Yeah. So it was, but it was also clearly calculated too. I thought it was meant to be calculated. It was kind of an announcement. I think those are important things to do. What time is it? What time is it? Okay, that's good. Okay, any last questions? All right. You look like you got better.
I'm glad it looks that way.
I'm sorry I went too long. I was into telling y'all that stuff. You're gonna pass that mic around? Yeah. Did you haven't changed your shirt in a whole week? What is wrong with your staff? All right, thanks guys.
And thanks for being here.